Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is the Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we go to first? Let's go to the Budapest Memorandum. What is that, you might ask? Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, and that word is important, comprises three substantially identical political agreements signed by the OSCE conference in Budapest in Hungary on December the 5th, 1994, to provide security assurances by its signatories relating to the accession of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. The three memoranda were originally signed by three nuclear powers, Russian Federation, the UK, and the US. China and France gave somewhat weaker individual assurances in separate documents. The memoranda signed in Patria Hall in Budapest Convention Center with US Ambassador Donald Blinken, amongst others in attendance, prohibited the Russian Federation, the UK, and the US from threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, quote, except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. As a result of the other agreements and the memorandum between 1993 and 96, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. And some say that had that not taken place, had Ukraine still had nuclear weapons, Russia would never have invaded. And yet they gave up their nuclear weapons in an agreement with Russia, and Russia would assure their security, and now Russia has invaded. But some people claim that the West has kind of defaulted here, and it's a West fault, so on and so forth. And actually, Ukraine the Latest on their Q&A podcast yesterday tackled this very question. So let's dip into what they have to say.
Thank you, Dom. Back to you, Francis. We've had this question a few times, but Raquel in Spain has sent this in. She asks, were the Ukrainians betrayed by the West at the Budapest Memorandum? So I think maybe just explain for us what that actually was.
Well, yeah, what a question. So yes, for listeners who aren't aware, the Budapest Memorandum is the political agreement signed in 1994 between Ukraine, the US, Russia, and the UK, which ensured Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for giving up its nuclear weapons. Now, this memorandum has been controversial as it's really unclear for many in Ukraine what legal obligations the signatories had to defend the country in the event of aggression. For many Ukrainians, they feel they were betrayed by the Western powers when Russia annexed Crimea. Many believe, rightly or wrongly, that the UK, the US had an obligation to come to their aid following the Russian annexation. Likewise, they think that giving up nuclear weapons was a mistake that left Ukraine naked to the danger of Russian aggression. Now, taking that last point first, many would argue that Ukraine didn't really have the necessary storage and security abilities in the mid-90s to retain those weapons on their soil. And if so, then I think the idea they could have retained them is possibly historical back projection. But the suggestion of betrayal regarding the security guarantees is more complex. Now, in brief, it's commonly said that the US and the UK, as well as Russia, of course, provided security guarantees, crucial word, to Ukraine, which were later disregarded. I think this is likely a mistake if you look at the wording. Now, Article 2 of the memorandum says that the three states provide security assurances, not guarantees, and that difference is crucial. To guarantee a state means to undertake to defend it if it's attacked by another state. So, for example, of course, from history, Britain guarantees Belgium in 1839 and Poland in 1939. Both of these guarantees led to the world wars because Britain was obliged by the guarantees to enter the wars to defend those countries, even though Britain hadn't been attacked itself at the time of entry. By contrast, a security assurance means that the assuring state must not attack the assured state. Thus, the US, the UK, and Russia simply agreed to not attack Ukraine at the Budapest Memorandum. They did not agree to defend Ukraine from an attack by another state. Thus, by that understanding, the US and the UK did not break their promises in the Budapest Memorandum, but Russia, of course, did. Now, I know this goes against many Ukrainians' understandings of the memorandum, but this is my understanding of the reality of the matter by reading into it. So to answer that question in simple terms, no, I don't believe that Ukraine was betrayed by the West, but it was certainly betrayed by Russia.
I think that does a really good job of summarizing the issues there. There's obviously a lot more nuance involved, I'm sure, but I think that's a nice little overview of the Budapest Memorandum and how it's Russia that have fallen foul of those security assurances. Okay, moving on to another topic. Let's look at farmers in Ukraine who are demining their fields with remotely controlled tractors. I've shown you similar things to this before, talked to you about how farmers are doing things like this in order to be able to farm their fields. It's really important for food food provision, not just for Ukraine but for the rest of the world. Ukraine is one of the bread baskets of the world, so it's really important that they are able to transport their, well, not just transport their food, but sow their food, sow their crops, grow their crops, harvest their crops. And sadly enough, with issues in all of those phases, it is going to be the poorest in the world who suffer, because the rich countries in the world will be able to afford food by paying higher prices for food that has less supply, and the poorer countries will be unable to do that, and it is those countries that will suffer the greatest. So it's really important anyway, that the whole world gets the food that they need, and Ukraine is a massively important part, plays a massively important part in that. Let's look at these. I'll read out the subtitles to you. I think it's probably just going to be music here. Yep. So these farmers are demining their fields with a tractor. Many had toy cars on radio controls, says this chap. It's the same principle, but instead of a small toy car, our huge tractor, we started up, and the tractor goes off on its own to work in the field. We don't even approach it. It's a risk to life. After consultations with specialists, farmers began to demine the fields themselves. Quote, we decided with the whole family that only after the sappers we would go into our fields. And since we have a large number of fields that are mined, we understand that deminers won't come to us very soon. As of now, they have been able to demine 60% of their fields. He says a TEM-62 exploded. It's an anti-tank mine. The road roller flew up to the level of the cab of the K700 tractor. All we had to do was change 2 wheels, and that was it. I mean, just take a look at what they've done. I think they've created their own sort of bespoke demining contraption that's put on the front of an old tractor here. Obviously, they don't want to blow up their newest tractor, I would guess. And these, I would think, have designed this contraption here. The heavy rollers, those heavy tires, are designed to set off the pressure triggered mines so that they would blow up, and then you're only losing sort of tires, possibly bits of metal that you can fix back together fairly easily with a bit of welding, so on and so forth. When that hit a mine, he's saying that it blew up to the level of the cab. All we had to do was change 2 wheels, and that was it. And yeah, that is a bit of ingenuity. Necessity is the mother of all invention. And it's great to see that happening. It's super important, obviously, for them to be able to do the farming that not only they need, but the rest of the world needs. Right, moving on to something completely different. Thomas C. Tyner, former artilleryman, Italian, sounds German. I think German-Italian descent there. How many troops and how much equipment is needed to hold a defensive line in a peer-level conflict? Estimates from a NATO member's handbook about holding 30 kilometers of front against mechanized and tank divisions is as follows. First trench line to slow down the attack, around 300 troops per kilometer, or 9,000 troops in total. Behind this trench, 600 main battle tanks, 900 infantry fighting vehicles, and 22,000 troops in 2 lines for a mobile defense. So remember, this is talking about the Russians. How many troops, how much stuff will they need to defend, for example, Zaporizhia? For example, anywhere that could be at risk of being the subject of a counter-offensive by the Ukrainians. So they would need, for 30 kilometers only, they would need 9,000 troops. Behind that trench, they would need 600 main battle tanks, 900 infantry fighting vehicles, and 22,000 troops in 2 lines for a mobile defense. Those 31,000 troops have 180 Spike ATGM launchers. Those are decent Israeli bits of kit, what they're talking about there. 900 Panzerfaust 3 launchers, 240 plus 81 or 120 mil mortars. So this is what is needed as according to the NATO members' handbook to defend 30 kilometers. You would also need at least 240 plus 155 mil howitzers, 2 medium range and 3 short range air defense battalions to back these troops up. In total, 54,000 troops should be deployed to hold 30 kilometers of front, with an additional 36,000 troops as maneuver reserve if the enemy should be able to break out. The maneuver reserve needs to have 400 main battle tanks, 600 infantry fighting vehicles, 180 155 mil howitzers. In total, 90,000 troops are needed to defend a front of 30 kilometers against a peer-level army, which commits 8 to 10 tank and motor rifle divisions for a major offensive. The Russians are holding about 800 kilometers of line front in Ukraine. So that is not 30 kilometers, that is 800 kilometers, which is well over 10 times that. Well, 30 kilometers, 300, so 20 times that, 600. So 25 times that, maybe a bit more, if my maths is correct. And Ukraine is about to commit an equivalent of 6 to 8 mechanized divisions to strike at just one point. And this may be disputed. I don't know whether there will be only one point, whether there'll be multiple points, whether they'll try and do the deep battle type tactics where they're probing to find a weakness and then pile in to just one point of that line. And the Russians don't know where. To be able to defeat the Ukrainian offensive before a breakthrough, the Russians would need something like 54,000 troops per 30 kilometers of front for the entire 800 kilometers of front inside Ukraine. This would be 1,440,000 troops, but let us just focus on the front line from the Dnipro River to Donetsk city, as Ukraine is most likely to attack in this sector, a roughly estimated 300 kilometers of front, which would require Russia to deploy 540,000 troops to defend it. And this does not include a maneuver reserve. How many troops does Russia actually have in the south? An estimated 90,000. So rather than 540,000, they have 90,000 troops, or about 300 men per kilometer of front, which equals what the NATO country's military assumes is needed just man a first trench line. Supposedly, Russia has something between 300,000, 360,000 troops in Ukraine. I believe it's less than that, he says. And even if the Russians commit most of their units to likely attack points, they don't have enough forces to stop a Ukrainian attack, neither in men nor in material. The key for Ukraine is to keep its point of attack secret until the last moment. Once committed, Ukrainian forces will break through the thinly manned Russian lines, and whatever maneuver reserve the Russians can muster in that area will find itself under incessant artillery and GMLRS fire while trying to move into position for a counterattack. The same will happen to whatever forces Russia will pull out of the front elsewhere and try to move towards the Ukrainian spearheads. Russia doesn't have the forces to defend the front it is trying to hold, and Russia doesn't have the transport capabilities nor the air defense assets to move its few reserve forces to meet a Ukrainian breakthrough. Furthermore, Ukrainian deception, feints, the diversionary attacks will make sure that Russia will have its reserve forces far away from the actual point of attack. Putin will throw everything he has at the Ukrainian offensive, and it will be a bloody and brutal battle, but also a battle which Russia can't win. They burned away the men and materiel to withstand a Ukrainian offensive in their futile attempts to take Bakhmut. Last but not least, right now, Russia has an estimated 10,000 troops in northern Crimea, 5 per kilometer of front. Now, to continue discussions of defences, Mick Ryan here pulls on Pasi Paroinen, who has done an analysis of the Russian defensive network, which we'll dip into soon. Lots of people have been sharing that. But let's just look at what Mick Ryan has to say. He said this is a very good thread on Russian obstacle zone development in Ukraine for a number of reasons. Ryan says, first, this is a very extensively fortified region with multiple defensive zones in depth. It is impossible to create such a complex for the entire length of the front line being defended by the Russians. The assessment, therefore, is that defensive complexes such as this give us insights into what the Russians view as a key terrain in the coming Ukrainian offensives. In other words, where they've built their defenses most robustly are, obviously the places that they fear are most likely to be attacked by the Ukrainians. Second, following on from this, it also provides insights into the Russians' appreciation of the most dangerous and most likely courses of action of the Ukrainians in their offensives. Given the massive resources required to site and build obstacles as well as lay mines and then cover them with observation and fire, the Russians would have done a detailed assessment of the theatre and prioritized key areas where they thought the Ukrainians would attack. This is obviously one of those areas, and it should be noted the vast majority of obstacles are not about stopping an enemy. They are more about channeling them into killing zones or breaking up their cohesion and their combined arms teams. Obstacle zones like this are also about slowing down such attacks, particularly in the event of surprise, to allow time for counterattack and counter-penetration forces to deploy at the tactical and operational levels. As part of such an obstacle complex, the Russians will also have an ISR plan to seek out, that's intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance plan, to seek out Ukrainian capabilities that are conducting recon of the obstacles. At least in competent Russian units, they will be engaging in a recon battle to deny close recon of these zones. And they will be looking for Ukrainian engineer equipment that has been pre-positioned for assaults. This will help the Russians confirm their appreciation of Ukraine's objectives. The Ukrainians will be undertaking deception ops to prevent the Russians collecting this info. None of this is sensitive or secret info. It is basic doctrine that all professional armies train to. The Russians have similar doctrine. It is prudent that we assume they understand these basic principles. The Ukrainians will. But in reality, having good doctrine and being able to implement it are two different things. We will see very soon how it plays out. Of course, tactical obstacles can have operational and strategic impacts if they are sited well, are appropriately covered with fire and observation, and there are sufficient mobile reserves. So we shall have a little look in further detail. But first, let's go back to Ukraine, the latest, to talk about mines, because that's kind of the context that we're dealing with here. I need to drink some more tea, so I will introduce again. This is Dom Nichols, who was a former tank crew member, being asked the first question here.
Dom, can I start with you? This is a question from Colin. He says, one thing that seems to be missed when we talk about the upcoming offensive, this is the anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive, we hear about tanks and the ammunition and gun barrels, smooth or rifled, but what about the issue of mines? Ahead of the Ukrainians will be minefields for many kilometres. How do tanks deal with mines? Dom Nichols.
Thanks, Colin. Tricky one. I mean, mines aren't good at all for movement across any piece of ground. And so tanks don't deal with them themselves. They have other vehicles, engineer assets basically, that are based on tank hulls that go and dig them up, shove them to one side, and as well as mines, these engineering assets cover gaps, rivers. They continue the motion. So the first thing that you do when you look at a piece of ground from a soldier's point of view is the engineers need to get involved to say, well, how am I going to safely cross that bit of ground? And it's just worth touching here on what's happening in Ukraine. So in January, we saw Germany announce it was going to send mine plows. These things will physically dig up buried pressure-fused mines, as in some mines go off by timing, some go off by acoustic if they hear a rumble of a tank, but others go off by pressure, as if you stand on them or you drive on them, they will go off. So that's a pressure-fused mine. So these mine plows will dig them up. Then in March, Germany also said it was going to be sending 3 Pioneer Panzer DAX military engineering vehicles. These are based on the Leopard 1 chassis, so all part of, like I say, that engineering effort. In March, also, the US said, as part of the $400 million package then, that it's going to be sending M60 Armoured Vehicle Launched Bridge System, AVLB as they're known. As the name suggests, they are little bridges, and they span a 60-foot gap to get across small rivers, gaps, etc., etc. And those are based on the old Patton tank. Now, like I say, for perspective, let's have a think about what minefields are and obstacles are. And
I think there's an awful lot of other armored engineering vehicles that are being provided as well, not just what Nichols has just said.
defenders can very easily waste their time producing huge obstacles and fortifications that are either just driven around or climbed across. And they can pour millions of tons of concrete into tank traps and minefields, and they can lay dragon's teeth and barbed wire. They can have it covered by, or they should have every obstacle covered by surveillance and firepower. And all of that can be for naught if you don't lay it correctly. And like I say, for perspective, the Atlantic Wall on D-Day was breached in 4 hours. The Bar-Lev line in the 1973 Yom Kippur War breached in 2 hours. And then in the 2003 Iraq War, the British 7 Armoured Brigade went through the Iraqi lines of minefields, anti-tank ditches and wire in 46 minutes. So if you know what you're doing and the enemy don't, when it comes to laying these obstacles, you can get past them. But yeah, so and
that's really significant. So if we're looking really optimistically at the situation, say in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, there are extensive fortifications and defensive works that the Russians have built, and they are challenging. But optimistically, if the Ukrainians are successful, then they can negotiate those defenses relatively quickly, break through, spread out, and then start attacking those defenses from behind. The question is, can they actually do that? Will they be able to do that successfully? And it's going to mean a combined arms maneuver that's involving lots of different arms of the military machine, the Ukrainian military machine, to work in cohesion with each other and successfully.
Of themselves, mines, not nice at all, but if you know where they are, you can drive around them. If they're not covered by fire, then that is not how you should employ them. And there are many, many assets, military assets from the engineering branches that can find them, dig them up, mark them, destroy them, and do what have you. But mines generally, I mean, there are so many different types, it's difficult to say one size fits all because it simply doesn't. But they could do everything from just blowing off the tracks, the tank tracks, and then suddenly you can't go anywhere. Or they can breach the hull and kill everyone inside, or they can knock out the engine so you can't move. When it comes to tanks and armoured vehicles generally, we talk about M-kill and K-kill. M-kill means mobility kill, so that the crew might survive, the gun could still be in action, the primary purpose for that vehicle could still be applicable, it just can't move anywhere, so it has very limited utility, but it can still shoot stuff. Or a K-kill, K doesn't stand for anything except kill, so kill, I suppose, if you like. But that's when the thing's completely wiped out. You're not going to use it again, and the crew are probably killed. So yeah, mines, very, very difficult to defeat if you're on top of them. Modern vehicles try to have V-shaped hulls to direct the pressure, the blast from a mine out the side. It might take off a wheel or two, might take off some tracks, but the crew will survive, and the vehicle could probably be recovered and used again. But actually, MRAPs, as they're called, mine resistance.
And just before he goes on there, I mean, those armored recovery vehicles, ARVs instead of AEVs, so ones with kind of cranes on or whatever, that can tow these vehicles away, are going to be super important as well. Because if you lose these vehicles, A, you don't want the enemy to get hold of them, and B, you want to be able to reuse them. So you want to take them back, fix them up, and bring them back to the front line in a few weeks' time or whatever.
Ambush protected vehicles, this fleet of vehicles, they are lighter vehicles, more infantry based, because tanks really can't have a V-shaped hull. Just the physics doesn't really work like that. They're big old lumbering beast tanks, so they've got fairly flat hulls, flat bottom to the hull, and that does not work well with a mine. So the idea is you just don't go near them. You have the engineers that identify the areas that are likely mined and deal with them and any other obstacles before you get anywhere near them.
Thank you very much for that. Francis, can I go to you? Let's zoom out.
So I think that was a nice little sort of soupçon of mines and defences information. Let's go then to Pasi Peroinen, thread. Analysis of Russian defensive network and field fortifications on the Kopani, Roboterna, Tokmak sector of the Zaporizhia front. So this is like pretty much slap bang in the middle of that Zaporizhia Oblast front line, coming down from sort of Orikhiv through to Tokmak. This analysis was done using Sentinel Hub EO imagery and commercially available high-resolution satellite imagery by Airbus, DS, Pleiades, and NEO. So there it goes, and there are, as you can see here, different areas of fortifications that are being indicated by the red hashing there. Russian defences have been constructed along dominant heights and ridgelines. Defences have been established at a depth of 25 to 30 kilometers from Russian forward line of friendly troops, FLOT, all the way to the city of Tokmak. There are several distinct layers or defensive zones. Zone 1, first 3 to 4 kilometers from the Russian FLOT, so from the front line, friendly troops, is the forward security zone consisting of individual squad or platoon outposts and individual company strongpoints. Zone 2, the first defensive line, 2 to 3 kilometers deep, company trenches and strongpoints arranged along key terrain features in a continuous line. This zone has seen recent additions and is constantly being improved. Villages of Kopani and Roboterna form the linchpins of this position. Zone 3, 4 to 5 kilometers deep zone with reserve and possible decoy positions. This zone is also where a majority of the local Russian artillery and mechanized reserves will be maneuvering behind the first defense line. Multiple shelter areas for vehicles and equipment observed. Zone 4, prepared main defensive line, massive multi-layered trench lines with anti-tank ditches and dragon's teeth obstacles. Extensive mines are likely. These fortifications form nearly uniformly continuous defensive belt across the front, built 3 to 4 kilometers deep. It doesn't finish there. Zone 5, reserve and fallback positions behind the main defensive line. Zone 3. Zone 6, town of Tokmak and the surrounding anti-tank ditch and strong points form the last fallback and reserve position on this sector, prepared for all-round defence. So you can see this is significant. If these are continuous and cover the whole of the front line in Zaporizhia, then this will take some serious thought for the Ukrainians to overcome. It's not saying they can't overcome it. It's not saying that if they're lucky or not even lucky, if they plan their attack to the T, then they can't negotiate these challenges quickly in certain places and, as I say, get behind, and then it all sort of breaks down, arguably. But if the Russians do a good job themselves, then these can present significant challenges for a counter-offensive. So to continue, I've compiled a collection of samples of different field fortification types and examples from across this sector. Note that the high-resolution Pleiades NEO images are from the 13th of March 2023, so they are quite old at this point. So we're now March, April, and we're coming up to the 13th of May, so they're almost 2 months behind. Many fortifications were under construction. A forwardmost Russian platoon strong point, 600 meters wide, so that's one there. And number 2, a 1.2 kilometer company trench line. Number 3, which is that entire picture actually. Number 3, 500-meter wide trench line in the tree line, and additional trenches under construction. So there you get the sort of trench lines that we're so used to seeing, these zigzag trench lines, and they're zigzag so you can't just go straight down the trench destroying people in one fell swoop. That it requires a bit more thought. And number 4, 2 squad or section outposts guarding the gap between the positions. So that would be, I presume, down sort of there, possibly. But nevertheless, you got an outpost. You got outposts within the tree line there. Okay. 5, we have company trench system that is 1,600 meters wide under construction, and then here so you got trenches and foxholes, and here number 6 we have anti-tank ditch at the northern edge of Robert Turner and small squad strong points. Number 7, we've got trenches, dugouts, and anti-tank ditches west of Robert Turner. Again, these are significant, but are they? I mean, they say they're continuous, but are they properly continuous? For example, this field there, is there a gap where these don't exist? And does that all you need is one weakness to overcome? So on and so forth. On to number 8, trenches under construction, the northern edge of Kopani. So again, more trenches, more examples. Here we have in picture 9, reserve trench under construction south of Robert Turner. And number 10, trenches and dugouts being constructed on heights overlooking Rivne. This picture number 11, 2 300-meter wide platoon strong points under construction. So that you can see that these strong points involve trenches going in different directions, giving a kind of network, and possibly maybe revetments back here where you can have vehicles or howitzers or whatever protected and operational. And then, so that's number 11. 12, a 300-meter wide platoon strong point between Solodka Balka and Novopokripivka. Thank you very much, words. There's just lots more evidence of these defenses. 13, around Solodka Balka, 11 kilometers behind the Russian front lines, a multi-layered main defensive line is being constructed. It comprises of anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth obstacles, minefields, and multiple consecutive trench lines at average depth of 2 to 3 kilometers. There you go. You can see these are extensive, and I think these will present at least some significant challenges. Notice the large number of dugouts and vehicle firing positions being constructed. These positions have been completed since then. Trenches in the same sample pictures 13A and 13B are roughly 3 kilometers in width and could serve as a battalion strong point. 14 to 15, as can be seen from this sentinel image, the Russian trench lines and fortifications continue on both sides of Solodka Balka, a strong point with multiple fallback positions and reserve trenches. Russians can deploy multiple battalions of infantry along this defensive belt. Finally, before Tokmak, there is a second robust reserve line 6 to 7 kilometers behind Solodka Balka. Tokmak is also surrounded by circular anti-tank ditch and several separate strong points. The village of Ocheretovate is also being fortified for all around defense. Just to give you a little bit more context of where we're talking about, so you've got Orikhiv here, you've got Tokmak there, and Melitopol further down to the southwest here. So between Orikhiv, or between the front lines, this would be the flot here, or they might even set that further back from there. You've got Robert Turner, and then it comes on to Solodka Balka. So we're talking about all of this area, sort of either side of that. But then coming back towards Tokmak, you've got further lines of defense before getting to Tokmak itself, which is in essence a defensive position. But that's enough for today. He says you can find more about the Russian fortifications on our map. He's got his own map for that. I think that gives you a pretty solid indication that at least in certain areas, and there are claims that it's continuous, but at least in certain areas, these defenses are going to be multi-layered and difficult to overcome. Once you've overcome one, there are several more to overcome. It's not going to be the kind of lightning thrust through to Tokmak and have that within a day type thing. I don't think that's going to happen. It depends on the breakthroughs. It depends on how the Ukrainians plan and whether they've got definite areas that they think they can blast through in really quick speed. That might happen. I'm not saying it won't happen. I'm just saying that we need to be aware that the counteroffensive could get bogged down if the Russian defenses work as they would intend. And this is why air superiority is super important. So if this was a kind of NATO engagement, what would have happened for the last few months, you would have had NATO air forces taking out at longer range, taking out all the air defenses, taking out the air force of the Russians, so that when it came to the counteroffensive, the airplanes the jets could support the Russian troops. They could take out entire lines of defenses. You could have bombing runs. You could have all sorts of different uses of the Ukrainian air force, the NATO air force in this case, so that the ground forces have a much easier job to do. When they get to some of these positions, these defensive lines, these trenches, they've already been taken out by air support, close air support. That's not going to happen here, and that's significant. That means that the ground forces are going to have to do all the work themselves, pretty much. I would guess. I don't know how the Ukrainians are going to use their air forces, but their air forces, as we'll find out soon, have real limitations in these kinds of engagements. So, talking about the Air Force, let's go on to look at the Ukrainian war jet pilots. Ukrainian war jet pilots talk about the air war with Russia, a BBC News article. Pick out some of these points. All the usual stuff. Most of you will probably know all of this anyway, but just kind of hammering it home. So, Silk, that's his call sign, which is the pilot's call sign, quickly dives his MiG-29 so low that he can see the treetops. The old Soviet-era aircraft starts trembling as it's pushed to the limit. Silk navigates through towers and hills that he studied meticulously on the map while preparing for the mission. Quote, such flights close to the surface are the most difficult ones, says Silk. You have to concentrate very hard, and because of the low height, you don't have the time or the space for a safe ejection. Fighter jets like the one flown by Silk accompany Ukrainian ground attack aircraft during their combat missions at the front line. Silk's job is to provide cover from the Russian air-to-air missiles, but there is not much Ukrainian jets can do to stop them. Interestingly, there's a lot to be said about how the Russians, and probably the Ukrainians as well, are operating in the air. They are operating in ones and twosies, like just often pairs of aircraft rather than a greater number of aircraft doing different things. So some aircraft are protecting the other aircraft while they're doing their bombing runs and so on and so forth. If you have air superiority, you'll be using your jets in that way. But neither side has air superiority, so they're just using single jets or pairs of jets in a very limited manner, scared to go too far or too high because they'll be taken out by air defenses, or in the Ukrainians' case, by opposing aircraft. So, quote, our biggest enemy is the Russian Su-35 fighter jets, he says. Actually says another MiG-29 pilot with a call sign Juice. We know positions of Russian air defense. We know their ranges. It's quite predictable, so we can calculate how long we can stay inside their zone. But in the case of fighter jets, they are mobile. They have a good air picture, and they know when we're flying to the front lines. It continues the article. Russian air patrols can detect a jet's takeoff deep inside the territory of Ukraine. Their R-37M missiles can hit an aerial target at a distance of 150 to 200 kilometers, whereas Ukrainian rockets can only travel up to 50 kilometers. That's a massive difference. This is one of the most important differences between the two aircraft, the air-to-air missile capabilities. And this is one of the biggest reasons why the Ukrainians are desperate for NATO airframes, because they can fire NATO. It's not so much the airframes in and of themselves, but it's what rockets they can use and fire. And some of the NATO rockets are just a lot better than the Russians, have greater range and greater capabilities themselves. So at the moment, the advantage is with the Russians. So Russian planes can see Ukrainian aircraft and shoot them down long before they pose any threat. Since the start of the Russian invasion, the Ukrainian Air Force has suffered serious losses, although they don't reveal specific figures. And this comes on to why I don't trust Russian figures, and I get so many Russian voices on my threads going, why don't you give the Russian MOD, you give the general staff figures for the Ukrainians, but you don't give the Russian MOD figures? And I say, well, because the general staff figures are more accurate, and here's why they're more accurate. And I spent something like 6 months telling you why they're accurate and giving you rationale for them being at least somewhat accurate. The trends are accurate, or the figures are supported by data, visual data, Oryx open source intelligence data, so on and so forth. So I say, right, these are they're not perfect, but compared to the Russian data, and it goes into it here, the Russian data is just absolutely fanciful. They've blown up over twice as many aircraft than the Ukrainians have. It's just physically impossible to a ridiculous level. So therefore, I just discount that. The Russian MOD just come out with absolute obvious nonsense. That's why I don't talk about their figures. Anyway, Russia's claim that they've destroyed more than 400 Ukrainian planes doesn't seem plausible. I mean, this is typical BBC understatement. Given independent estimates of the Ukrainians' fleet sizes are at least half that number. Well over. So I think it's 416 aircraft that Russian MOD have claimed to shoot down, and the Ukrainians have only got 124. And they're still operating. Apparently, at one stage, sort of 85% of that was still 80 to 85% was still operational. So the Russian numbers are just absolutely nuts. Anyway, the article continues later with a quote: "Our jets don't have a system to warn about Russian rocket launches," says a pilot of the Su-25 attack jet with the call sign Pumba. "It's all visual based. If you see them, then you just try to escape by firing off heat traps and maneuvering. Russia's air superiority means that Ukraine can afford only a limited deployment of its military aviation close to the front line. So now think about the counteroffensive, which can have a major impact on the success of any future counteroffensive operations. According to Juice, they carry out up to 20 times fewer sorties than the Russian Air Force. And the weapons Ukrainian attack aircraft have are from the stock of old Soviet-era bombs and unguided rockets, which are quickly depleting because of limited supplies. But it's not just air support for ground troops. Western jets can also enhance Ukraine's air defense systems, aviators say. Quote, "Our aircraft have old radars and don't see Russian cruise missiles. We are like blind cats when we try to shoot them down," Colonel Lokhachov explains. And so on and so forth. It sort of goes on to talk about how it's important to get NATO airframes and NATO weaponry on those airframes and their radar capabilities, so on and so forth, all the stuff we already know. But I just thought that was useful to fuse together all these ideas about the coming counteroffensive and about the Russian defenses that may be in place and the challenges that Ukraine will have. They will have to do most of their work to overcome these challenges on the ground without close air support. Not in the way that NATO would expect it out of their sort of doctrinal handbooks. It's going to be challenging, but that's not to say it can't be done and can't be done really successfully. We shall see. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all the support you give. Thanks to all the new members that come on board. I'll do a new member end piece in the next few days when I get a bit of time. As I say, thank you. Please like, subscribe, share, hit bells, blow whistles. Stand on one leg. After all, it is Tuesday. Anyway, complete nonsense. Speak to you later.